Thank you and welcome. This is the beloved community of Los Angeles, and we have the beloved community of UCLA, and we have the beloved community that Pastor Foy works with also. And we're getting together, we're merging all of beloved community because we realize during this day and time, it is so important that we deal with issues of coming together, issues that are important to our community, and realizing and developing a way that we can fight together. There are horrible problems facing Los Angeles, but our community has decided that we're not going to just talk about it, we're going to do something about it. And so tonight, we're talking about racial and juvenile justice and criminal justice and what we can do. We brought the voice of the community here, someone that all of us trust and believe in, and that is our brother Gascon, our district attorney Gascon. He has come in as a fighter to initiate things that are important to communities of color, communities of Latino communities that are marginalized, vulnerable, deficient, disenfranchised. And so we need to clear up the whole judicial process. And this is not a campaign, but I feel this is a man that can do it. So we're very glad that he's here, and our other two distinguished guests that we will hear from shortly, and they will be introduced. But at this time, thank you on behalf of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Our chairperson, Mr. Anton Farmby, is right here in the back with us also, and others, our youth, some of our Martin Luther King Young Dreamers of Justice are on their way to participate here because we're just building a movement. So God bless you and thank you. Pastor Foy.
We're going to ask our distinguished colleague from UCLA, beloved community, to come.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Vusi Sizwe Azania. I think that's why Reverend Foy was like, man, I'm not going to try to butcher this brother's name. But so my name is Vusi Sizwe Azania. I serve as a community service and student risk education advisor here at UCLA. I work with students that create community service projects to go out and provide direct service related to health, education, and specific social justice issues like formerly incarcerated youth, homelessness, et cetera, et cetera. I also serve as the vice president of the Black Staff and Faculty Association. I serve in the capacity as the vice president of special programs and community engagement. But for our purposes here tonight, this evening, I'm a co-founder and director of the UCLA Beloved Community Initiative. It's something that we started in 2015. We had an opportunity to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's visit to UCLA. I was a student at UCLA from 1980, left campus in 92, and in those 12 years I had no idea that Dr. King visited UCLA. You know, I come back to campus 2006 in my present capacity, and I see this article that says we're putting a plaque to commemorate Dr. King's visit. I'm like, what? So photocopied that circa 2010, fast forward 2014, 2015 academic year, Selma's coming out, the film by Ava DuVernay, an alum. The communications department had rediscovered the speech that Dr. King gave. And I said, nobody's thinking about doing a program to commemorate. So put a proposal together, and 9 years later, here we are. So we have a big event called Beloved Community Awareness Week that goes from the third Tuesday of April to the fourth Tuesday of April. And I'll end on this note. We picked that odd week because April 15th, 1947 was the third Tuesday of April when Jackie Robinson reintegrated Major League Baseball. April 27th, 1965 was the fourth Tuesday of April when Dr. King visited. So there you have this from the third Tuesday to the fourth Tuesday, framing of what we call Beloved Community Awareness Week here at UCLA. So I've got a flyer for a launch event that we're going to have that actually kind of conflicts with something that Pastor Smart is doing. But so we have a whole series of events, but I'll make sure that folks in attendance this evening are made aware of those opportunities, and for those who can come out and participate with us, you're welcome. Thank you.
I'm a lot shorter. Hello, everybody. My name is Patsy Oster. I'm a member of the planning committee for this event, and I am pleased to introduce Pastor Gary Williams. I met Pastor Gary Williams and his wife, Myrna LaRue Jefferson Williams, on an 11-day bus trip from Arizona to Washington, D.C. for voting rights, to promote voting rights. On the trip, we were encouraged to change seats and talk to everybody else on the bus and learn their life stories. How often do you get an opportunity to meet someone who has a background completely different from your own, and a person who is perceptive and generous in communicating their life story? That was my experience. It was a privilege to meet and talk to Pastor Williams, who's been so successful in turning his life around. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he is the pastor of St. Mark, LA, United Methodist Church in the heart of South Los Angeles, and co-chair of the CLU Board of Directors, correct? Pastor Gary has a progressive, prophetic, and transformative vision of what South Los Angeles can be. Pastor Gary's wife, Myrna, who's seated here, is a gifted teacher and church leader, also a passionate advocate for all people. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce Pastor Gary Williams to all of you who may not have already met him and heard his story. Pastor Williams.
So that means I'm first? Okay, do I go to the podium? Okay. Okay, excuse me. Sure, yeah, please. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the wonderful introduction. It humbles me to be sitting next to our district attorney. Yes, what a pleasure. So I'm supposed to share my journey, right? Born and raised in South Los Angeles. I was raised in the 60s and 70s. When I say South Los Angeles, I lived on the east side of the 110 freeway, within walking distance of USC, which was a place I could not walk on the campus at that time. I was chased off the campus, as a little kid. But that's some of my earliest memories. Another memory I have early on, when I was about 13 years old, me and some of my friends were hanging out on the corner like we do in the neighborhood. Anybody know about hanging on the block? And police came through, black and white unit. We were not doing anything, and they jumped out of the car and told us to put our hands on the hood of the car and don't move. And we had our hands on the car, and I went to scratch my face, and he said, "I told you not to move." And he put me in a chokehold. This is before Daryl Gates. This is a chokehold back in maybe 1970. And they choked me unconscious and left me laying on the sidewalk, and they drove off. And when I came to, my friends were just standing there. I didn't know what had happened. That's another early memory that I have. I'm an only child. I was raised in a neighborhood. We lived right down the street from a church that my mother drugged me to every Sunday. I was very active in church, but I lived in a community where I was more enticed by the street life, by folk that were going in and out of jails, and folk that were drug users and gang members and stuff like that. When I was a kid, I was told as a little boy, said you won't become a man until you go to jail. And I believed that growing up. And so I had, I began to, I graduated from high school, but throughout high school and all the way through my early youth and young adult years, I was addicted to drugs. For a number of years, I struggled. I was a part of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s. And through all of the 80s and the 90s, I was in and out of treatment facilities. I was able to, it's weird, I was able to graduate from Cal State LA with a degree, but I could not kick that habit. And because of that, I found myself incarcerated on many occasions. At the end of my criminal career, I had 4 felony convictions and 1 misdemeanor. I got a sales and possession case with a piece of crack that wasn't even enough to smoke. And they gave me a sales and possession case for that. My last arrest was December the 26th, 2002. And I've been free since then, drug-free. I went through a program, got the help that I needed, and I've never looked back. But through those incarcerations, there was a time that I was held way past my release date, and I was a part of an early lawsuit that was against the county jail system because they held me. Do you remember how much time I was held? About a couple of months past my due date. And so I've experienced inside. I've seen the way that we live inside the jail, the incarceration, especially the county jail, where the separation and the black and brown conflict is a constant in there. I've seen the riots. I've been a part of that kind of stuff, and it's like during that time period, it was like that was what went on. And the deputies turned their back. It just happened, you know. So I came through all of that. I got clean. I started doing 12 steps. I went back to school again, became a drug and alcohol counselor, got a certificate in that. I did that for a couple of years. And then eventually I went to Claremont School of Theology, and I went through a 3-year seminary program and graduated with a Master of Divinity degree. At 51 years old, and I was ordained in the United Methodist Church. And when I went through the process of ordination, there's an interview, but prior to the interview, they had to do a background check. And they went back 7 years. Well, my last felony was 8 years. But I shared with them openly and honestly about everything I had done. And they told me at that point that they had to rethink the way that they brought candidates through the system. And so I was ordained, and I've been pastoring now since 2010. I'm in my 7th year at the church that I'm at now. It's an amazing congregation right in the heart of South Los Angeles. We're right near Manchester and Western. I think that's enough for my story, but thank you for letting me share that with you.
Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? Great to see everyone here today, and thank you to all the speakers that came out. George Gascon, wonderful to see you again. Pastor Williams, great to meet you. And I have the privilege of, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Do Kim. I'm with the president of the K.W. Lee Center for Leadership, which is a nonprofit youth center in the heart of Koreatown. And I'm also a civil rights attorney. And it's a pleasure to be on the planning committee and to work with Pastor Smart, who is one of the great leaders of our city of Los Angeles. And anytime he calls, I'm going to be there, do what I can to assist and to be part of the beloved community that he's creating here at UCLA, but also in the city of Los Angeles. I have the honor of introducing Kiara Dashell. She is someone who has a mighty voice, and that voice comes from her personal experience. And she is a young person who is on staff at ARC, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, that works, one of the leading organizations in the city of Los Angeles and also in the country, working on re-entry issues. And she is one of the heads of the women's department there, working on advocating for women inside the prisons. And for her, this is very personal for her because at a young age, she was sentenced to life in 2007 under the felony murder rule. And later on, while she was still incarcerated, she was kind of like the liaison. She was a liaison between the women and also the administrative staff. So in a sense, she was kind of like since we're in Jackie Robinson Conference Center, she was kind of like the point guard. She was the leader of the women that were incarcerated. And she was bringing their issues to the administrative staff. And so she had that kind of leadership. So when she came out after 14 years, after SP 1437 took place and she was resentenced, she also became a leader out in the community. And that's what she's doing right now, working on behalf and advocating for women that are incarcerated. And another interesting fact that I found out is that she's also a law student at the People's College of Law. So she's in her second year, and I think she said she'll be graduating in 2025, and she wants to be a civil rights attorney. And I know she's on her way, because probably the most important thing, I think, to becoming a civil rights attorney is your purpose and belief in yourself. And I know she's got that. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kiara.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Thank you, Mr. Kim. It's a pleasure to be here. Most importantly, it's a pleasure to be sitting next to George Gascon. It was his progressive policy that actually led to me being free from incarceration. So I want to thank him personally. I never thought that I would get the chance to sit here. I did prepare a speech, so I'm going to kind of read off of it and then flow on my own a little bit. So it says, the rehabilitation of offenders while under imprisonment is meant to benefit the individual, the community, and the public. This would be the case if we lived in the perfect world. But we live in a realistic one, where the criminal justice system is not only ineffective, it sometimes ends up doing more harm than good. Hi, I am Kiara Dashell. I got mixed up with the wrong crowd and did the wrong things. Unfortunately, I ended up in prison. Fortunately, I left there having a new lease on life with a purpose. Sadly, I am one of the few that come out with this outcome. This is my story. I too, like you, grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a region that is systematically disenfranchised. And we all know that. There's so many social challenges like homelessness, mental illness, drug addiction, and alcohol dependency. All these crimes or situations, circumstances are punishable by law. And the high level of poverty and unemployment are prerequisites to criminal tendencies. The people there that we look up to, they're already bound to prison and jails, and these are the people we look up to. These are the people we want to be like. I found myself on the wrong side of the law, and I felt like this was set up. This is what I was destined to be. This was my destiny because of the environment that I lived in. As a teen and as a youth, I ended up on the wrong side of the law. At 18 years old, I had a murder conviction. Despite the fact that I was academically talented, young, black, with all the potential and all the hopes and all the dreams that a teenager should have, I still found myself on the wrong side of the law. In my case, my bright future took a wrong turn. My introduction into the criminal justice system was through a trial period. There I was exposed to the dehumanizing and unfair treatment right from the onset. I remember the judges, the district attorneys, the victim's family, and the court personnel using derogatory and debasing language to describe the person that I was. And that was crazy to me because they never knew me. They didn't know that I was kind, that I was courteous. They took the worst moment in my life, the worst mistake that I made, and they used that to define me. It was meant for them to see me as a criminal, despite the fact that I was a first-time offender, a person, a human, and I had feelings. None of that impacted my sentence, so I was bound to prison and sentenced to life. Prison came with harsher names, harsher conditions, and harsher outcomes. I was made to believe that I was a villain who had thrown their life away and that I was useless in society. And the crazy part is that when you hear that over and over and over in a place that's supposed to rehabilitate you, you start to believe that. This is why probably 6 months into my incarceration, I ended up assaulting a police officer. I started to realize that the place, that the environment that I was in was negatively impacting me. And that was crazy because prisons, jails, you hear, they are there to rehabilitate you. They are there to make you better. But the conditions that people, men and women, face in prison are actually built to break you down, punish you. I took it upon myself to seek redemption. I said this wasn't enough. It wasn't an easy process. And with each day, I gained the drive to seek knowledge and harness the few opportunities that prison had. Fast forward, by the time that I was released, 14 years later, I had 2 degrees, a paralegal certification, and I was equipped with dreams and goals and aspirations of changing the criminal justice system. I am now currently the Women's Department Coordinator at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. This program is aptly named, I think I can speak loud. This program is aptly named because of the new life a person convicted of a felony gets once they're released. It symbolizes all the paths that we can take, and we exist to the point to them to go into the right direction. The Anti-Recidivism Coalition is committed to reducing recidivism and playing an integral part of reforming prisoners as environments for healing and positive growth. And what it's crazy is that we have to wait to get outside to get these services that we should be getting on the inside. Prison should be designed as a place of healing and rehabilitation instead of punishment. The Anti-Recidivism Coalition was a response to the understanding of the detrimental effects of incarceration. Although the intention is rehabilitation and a new lease on life, the outcome is quite the distant opposite. We don't realize, and society doesn't realize, that the effects of unprocessed physical and emotional trauma before prison become significantly compounded during the trials, during all the court hearings, and in the incarceration, and topped out with the degrading treatment and living conditions. Time inside changes your personality and negatively impacts your self-esteem. I want you guys to imagine being locked in a cage for 24 hours a day for over 8 years, and you think that that is rehabilitation. You are only allowed to shower. That's it. You and your bunkie are sitting in a cell for 24 hours a day. Imagine the impact that that has on your mental, spiritual, and emotional attitude. And you tell me after that, getting out, would you be ready and fit for society? I don't think so. It impedes your interpersonal skills and alienates you from humanity. The consequences is that when people get out of incarceration, for those who are not able to take the rehabilitative programs that are offered to a selective few, they do what? They fall back into their old lifestyles. Our services at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition are tailored to the individual needs of each person we support, enabling them to identify and build the skills and confidence they need to live independently as they reintegrate back into society in a positive manner. We organize accommodations, we provide transitional housing, and we provide educational opportunities. And if we can develop a prison system that looks like this, that looks like that, we would not be afraid to let people out of those cages and let them live amongst us as community members. I now lead a program where we take district attorneys, and that's very crazy because I never thought that I would be partnering with district attorneys, but we take them back inside prisons. We let them see that people have the ability to change if they have the resources. This proves that people that are convicted of a crime can, guess what, return back into society and positively have an impact on their communities. My thirst for knowledge and education never died while I was in prison. On the contrary, it doubled. I am in my second year of law school, as Mr. Kim said. I passed the baby bar on my first try, and I always brag that it took Kim Kardashian like 4 times to pass it, but I passed it on my first time. And I want to use that knowledge, I want to use my experiences not to be bitter, not to say, oh, let's not incarcerate people, but to change the criminal justice system. I want to change this tough on crime mentality that permeates the criminal justice system, and we can make it a more dignified system with results, okay? With results that rehabilitate human beings once they've made a mistake. I hope, and my hope, is to keep as many young people as I was. I was 18 years old, and I know that legally I was an adult, but mentally I was still a child. And it is my goal to keep as many young people as I possibly can from going down the same path that I went through. I will leave you with the words of Michelle Alexander, who is one of my favorite civil rights activists. She says, as a society, our decision is to heap shame and contempt upon those who struggle and fail in a system designed to keep them locked up and locked out. Says far more about ourselves than it does about them. Thank you for letting me speak here today.
Thank each of you for sharing your stories, and I commend you. I have not experienced incarceration, but I have a brother who's been incarcerated for 42 years. He's not in the state of California, but in the state of Louisiana, and he's getting a hearing on May 15th, and so I would elicit your support, those of you persons of faith, your prayers, and hopefully he finally gets his freedom. Again, thank you. Let's give our guest another applause. I met George Gascon through being invited to a house event. And I think it was one of the initial public gatherings where he would announce his candidacy for the DA for LA County. When he was introduced, he stood up, began to speak softly, but firmly and with conviction as to why he was seeking to become LA County's 43rd District Attorney. 2 things stood out for me during his speech. First, he shared his experience as a beat cop or a street cop and his rise within the LAPD to assistant chief, and then ultimately becoming chief of police in Mesa, Arizona. He told the truth about the culture of LAPD and police culture in general. And he admitted that he had become part of this culture, a culture that weaponized police officers to criminalize or to treat people of color, especially as criminals. The rawness with which he described the culture of policing that all too many of us, that is, especially persons of color, are experienced with, was eye-opening to me. And then the second thing that then candidate Gascon described in his conversion, I use that word loosely, a religious word, but let's say, and his transformation, was that he told us that he began to see the outcomes or results of policing and the criminal justice system. He saw mainly black and brown folk filling our jails and being sentenced unfairly, and then disproportionately carted off in shackles and chains to spend longer terms in prison than other persons, non-persons of color, who committed the same crimes, but got lesser sentencing, in many cases, no prison time at all. And here is the kicker that really got me. The thing about then candidate Gascon really got my attention when he said, and I was a part of this, but now I want to change it. I remember that. In 2020, the voters of LA elected him to bring about change. He has the opportunity tonight to tell us about the progress that he has made in bringing about the change that the electorate wants or wanted from their DA. So, my colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the 43rd LA County District Attorney, the Honorable George Gascon.
You know, I want you to think for a moment. 20 homicides. Think about it. 20 homicides. That's at least how many African Americans will be murdered by the end of today, by the time we get to midnight today. You know, according to studies as recently as 2019, about over 7,400 of the people that are victims of murder in this country are black. It's about 52% of all homicides in this country, yet our African American population is around 13 to 14%. You know, we talk about justice, we talk about safety, but you cannot have justice and safety when you have the disproportionality that we continue to experience in this country that is impacted by a systemic racism that is baked into so many parts of our life. The reality is that from very young age, African American and other poor people in this country are put into situations where they're exposed to extreme violence, to trauma, where there's a lack of real educational opportunities, where there's a lack of health care, where they're being singled out often and criminalized at very early stages for behavior that in other communities may never reach to the level of an arrest and a conviction. Again, 20 homicides at least today, by the end of today. The generational neglect that we continue to experience in this country when it comes to poor people, but especially the black community, will never, never give us an opportunity to get to a different place unless we stop that. When I run to become the 43rd elected district attorney in LA County, I talked about a very clear platform. And that platform was based on my own personal experience, which dates back from when I was a young officer in the LAPD and went through the ranks and then becoming the chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, in San Francisco, and then the district attorney in San Francisco. And I often talked about the fact that I was a poor kid from Cudahy who used to run away when we saw the sheriff cars coming down, because we knew that we were generally going to get stopped, and street lingo, we were going to get jacked up. And that was just the way that things went. High school dropout, going into the U.S. Army, actually getting my high school diploma, beginning my college career in the U.S. Army, and then coming out, finishing my college, my undergraduate degree, joining the LAPD, and then growing within the police department to a place where I believe that I became part of the problem. And then sort of as I continued to grow, continue to expose myself to other ways of thinking and maturing professionally, realizing that so much of what we were doing often in the name of public safety was actually causing more harm than good. And that is not to say, by the way, that people that harm others should not be held accountable. Clearly, they should and they must. The question is what that accountability looks like, right? The question is, what does that accountability look like? The question is the journey as to how people end up in American jails and prisons. Because that journey is different depending on the color of your skin. A fight between two kids in a high school schoolyard, two white kids in a middle class neighborhood probably end up with a teacher stopping the fight and telling them, maybe send them to the principal's office and then maybe some kind of administrative sanction, maybe not. Two black kids in a black neighborhood are going to end up with handcuffs because there will probably be a crime report. And that begins a journey. And it's a journey that is irreversible in many cases. Yes. So when I became the district attorney, I became based on a very clear platform that there were certain things that we were going to do differently. We were going to do everything that we could to hold people accountable, but we were also going to work in reducing the impact of mass incarceration. Because we cannot have justice, we cannot have peace, we cannot have safety if we continue to treat people in ways that dehumanizes them and takes justice away from the equation. I also run on a platform clearly saying that kids should be treated like kids. And if I were going to be the district attorney, that kids would no longer face the harsher punishments of being treated as adults. Because we know that when we take, frankly, even an 18-year-old, but as Kaira mentioned, the law says that you're an adult at 18. We know that our brains are not fully developed until we're in our 20s. And I often say jokingly, but I mean it, for us guys, it's usually until we're in our 40s, right? I think ladies develop much more quickly than we do. But certainly a 17, a 16, a 15, or a 14-year-old should not be in the adult legal system. And we know that when we put young kids into the adult criminal system, they don't rehabilitate. They get worse. And they often, frankly, in order to survive, they have to fight their way through, and often that actually gets them to a worse place. You know, I had a young man tell me once that for a 16-year-old, when you go to adult prison, you have two choices. You either become prey or you become predator. So he decided that he was going to be a predator because he was not going to be anybody's prey. And then he embarked on the following 15 years of incarceration and being a predator until he finally had an opportunity to start thinking differently. But that was a young man at 16 years of age, first 20 years in prison, and then it took him another 10 years to get out. Right. So I said we are going to treat kids like kids. I also talk about the fact that we have to end generational violence within all of our poor communities. And that in order to do so, we're going to have to work in a different way. We're going to have to bring community to the table, because at the end of the day, communities know best. Sometimes they're not empowered to discuss what they know or how to go about it. Sometimes they're not given the resources, but they know best. So we created community advisory boards, because we wanted to bring the community into the house. And Tiffany Blacknell, who is part of our staff, an incredible member of our organization, took it upon herself to start bringing community into the office. And we started with the very first community advisory board was victims. And we brought in not the victims that you usually see in political ads and the victims that you often see at standing in state capitals talking for more punishment, but we brought in the broad spectrum of victims in our community, because you know the majority of our victims actually happen to be black and brown. Are often the same people that go on to harm someone else, because it's a vicious cycle of violence. And often in the black and brown communities, the definition of accountability and justice is very different than that of a middle class or an upper class white community. Because yes, you want people to be held accountable. Yes, you want the pain to stop. Yes, you want to be safe. But you also want to support redemption and rehabilitation, because you're talking about members of your community, our community. So the thought about how accountability, how justice is going to be dispatched is very different. And we wanted to have those voices in our office, because the voices that we often heard were only the voices of punishment, as if somehow punishment was going to make a person whole. Even though there are many, many studies, including one that was done in 2020 here in LA County, where over 60% of the victims of violence in LA County said that they believe that rehabilitation has to be part of the equation. And they also criticized my office for not providing trauma-informed care, because our definition of how to take care of the victims is make sure that you know what the court date is and show up for court and be a good witness so we can get a conviction, and then you go figure out the rest. Because that was the definition of how we take care of victims. You know, often, well, not often, recently I was at an event where there were different panels, and at one point there was a panel and we had the class sisters. And how many of you remember Poly Class? Okay, for the young people here, let me give you a little bit of education. Poly Class was a young child who was kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered in the 1990s. And as a result of her brutal murder, we created in California the first 3-strike laws in the country. And we went from being on par with the rest of the country and the rest of the world on our incarceration rates, to within a short period of time, by the end of the 1990s, we had 190,000 people in our prison system. We were around 28,000 in our prison system in the early 80s. And we never looked back for the following 40 years. And you know what the class sisters told us when they were talking to us? And they were young girls, by the way. They were a little older than Polly. In fact, they were 7 and 9, I believe. So when we were in pain, when we were suffering, when we needed somebody to deal with our trauma, we were given 3 strikes. No one ever stopped to think about what we needed. No one ever stopped to treat our trauma. And the one sister said, it took me until I was well into my late 20s to finally realize that I needed to deal with trauma. And you know what? That was so consistent with what we heard from victims over and over again in our work. So we put together a Victims Advisory Board. And then we put an African American Advisory Board, and a Latino, and an LGBTQ, and an AAPI that has helped us tremendously in dealing with hate crimes. And we're getting ready to put others. So we brought in the community to do our work. Because in the way that we're going to deal with generational violence is to work with community in order to do this work. I also talk about police accountability because I don't think you can escape that. If you're talking about shifting the system into a place that we can have legitimacy in every community. Because the experience of the black community when it comes to policing is conflicted. Right? The black community wants to see police officers in their community. They want to be protected like any other community. Interestingly enough, in my experience, the African American community is not anti-police, to the contrary. Almost every time that we had a bond fund to raise funding to build new police stations or something, we knew that actually it was South LA that would vote solidly to get money for policing. And I see JT back there, who brother and I used to work in the LAPD together, and we knew that. You know, we knew that actually it was in South LA that we could count an overwhelming majority of the black community voting for us. But at the same time, these are the communities that were saying, you continue to harm us. You continue to harm us. So part of what I said during my election cycle and we're doing is said, you know, the majority of the police officers are out there doing a good job working under extremely difficult conditions. But when a police officer violates the public trust, they must be held accountable just like any one of us. Because the legitimacy of the entire system depends upon that equality of accountability. There cannot be one law for everybody else and a separate law for police officers. So we're on the journey to make sure that that occurs. Helping good police, enhancing the work that we do to make sure that we go after people that are harming us, but also holding police accountable. Because that is central to the ability for us to gain the legitimacy that is important in order for us to really bring justice for all and bring safety to our community. And I'm going to stop now because I know that we have many questions, and I just wanted to thank all of you for this opportunity, Pastor Martin, all of you that are here today, especially after work perhaps, you know, this evening, and where you could be doing things that are better than certainly being here today. But I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, D.A. Gascon. At this point, we want to entertain some questions, and want to start with questions to our two panelists, Pastor Williams and Mr. Shell. Mr. Shell? Okay. And if you have any questions for them, please raise your hand. And we have a number of questions that we have received from others, perhaps folk who are viewing in from Facebook, that we want to raise to the DA. Yes, sir.
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for sharing your stories. I think they're very powerful testimonies. And it's kind of a two-part question for everyone to a certain extent. For the individuals, sister and brother, what was the catalyst to get you to change the course, to change the path within your life, knowing you're in the system, knowing your environment, knowing, as you said, sister, so many don't have the outcome that you were able to achieve. What inside of each of you brought you to these very successful and transformative outcomes that you now both live?
I guess my background growing up in a church where I was surrounded by people that had succeeded in life, that were educators. I had an attorney, as a member of my church, those kind of things. So I knew it was possible, and I always knew I had potential to do more than what I was doing. That last run that I went on and that last arrest, when I was sitting in that jail cell, I was able to just kind of like what we talk about in recovery is play the tape all the way back, you know, and I began to really remember who I was supposed to be. And I just made a decision at that point to do everything possible to turn my life around. Not in a religious way, you know, but I'm a religious person, but it takes more than religion. And so I was able to surround myself with people that were were successful. And I was mentored by men and women that they saw something in me, and my wife was one of them. She stayed with me through all of that. She saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself, and so that helped me to finally get to a place of making a decision to break that cycle of incarceration and drug addiction.
I think for me, it was, one of the primary things was, number one, I had to realize that I had done something wrong. And I think when we are incarcerated or when we go to jail, the first thing, the primary thing that we think about is, oh, well, the police did this wrong, they did this wrong, they did this wrong. We start to think about like all the injustices that are happening with the criminal justice system, and that takes our focus off the fact that, yeah, those are injustices that happen after you did something wrong. So it was me sitting down with myself, realizing that you made a terrible decision. And I don't say mistake because it was a decision that I made. It was the wrong decision. And once I realized that I had made the wrong decision, I had to determine, well, what are the right decisions? Are there right decisions? And so I started to look at people in prison who were making the right decisions. And those decisions led to them being free, led to them going home. So it didn't click immediately, but I had to tell myself, okay, well, do you want to spend the rest of your life in prison? Because that's what you're sentenced to. No. So what are you going to do about it? I'm going to start following those people who are making the right decisions. And I think in our communities, the problem is we don't see enough people making the right decisions. But if we could see that, we would follow those decisions and say, well, I don't have to do this, I can do that. So I think number one is realizing first that I had done something wrong.
instead of thinking about all the wrong that was done to me afterwards, and then following people who were making the right decisions. And then after that, it was just natural.
You have another question? Anyone? Let me give someone else an opportunity first. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. Welcome, Senor Gascon. As we sit in this room, I'm looking behind you, looking at a picture of Mr. Rayford Johnson. I believe he was the first or second African-American president on campus. And the third president I'm familiar with is Bobby Grace. I believe he's in your office as an outstanding attorney. And I have just one simple question, because your opening was disturbing. And I really think that, I think this is, in my opinion, I think it's an economic issue. But as we sit here in this space of talking about criminality, to you, what does abolition look like? And I appreciate your response. Thank you for being here.
Sure. So I'm going to begin by telling you I am not an abolitionist, and I have never said that I am. I mean, Tiffany Blacknell, on the other hand, will stand up and say I am an abolitionist. I actually believe that part of the social contract, if you will, in a civilized society is that you have to have good policing, that sometimes some people that are dangerous may have to be segregated by the rest of us for a period of time. The lowest level of time, the better, but nevertheless, there may be a time where people need to be taken away from the rest of our community because they're dangerous. I believe that we need to have prosecutors, but I'm not sure that we need to have as many prosecutors as we do. So for me, it's about right-sizing the system. For me, it's about looking at the cost of incarceration in this country and understanding that when we start adding so many years to a sentence, what we're doing is we're taking the money away from schools, we're taking the money away from public health. Frankly, we're taking away money from fixing potholes or having police officers in the street. So if you look, for instance, at California, because it's what I'm most familiar with, our budget, our state prison budget last year, and when I said last year, it's actually the current year, but it was passed last year, was $16 billion and a little, just say $16 billion for round figures. Out of that $16 billion, we spent 4% on rehabilitation and reentry. 4%. And yet, we know that 95% of the people that go to prison are coming back out at some point. And if we're really thoughtful and we really care about the safety of all of us, including the person coming out, we want to make sure that when people come out, they're ready to be out. And yeah, we keep putting people out. We give them a couple $100 and tell them to go report to your parole officer and put you in untenable conditions where you're unemployable because we gave you a criminal record that we're almost ensured that you're unemployable, or you come out with severe mental health problems, because by the way, when you went to prison, if you did not have mental health problems, you sure as heck probably will by the time you get out. If you did not have a drug addiction problem, by the time you get out of prison, you will, because first of all, drugs are readily available, and secondly, in order to cope, you start self-medicating yourself because you need something to zone out until you have, a moment that perhaps you start saying, okay, I'm going to go in a different direction. So for me, it's about right-sizing the system, understanding that we need to spend more into education, more into public health, more into mental health. We need to spend more of that budget that we put into our prison system into rehabilitation and reentry. And you know, the interesting thing about all this is that these are not novel ideas. Number one, this is the way other countries have been doing it for years, and the recidivism rates are substantially lower than ours. Ours hovers around 70%. I mean, you think about it, how many of you would buy a car if the car salesperson would tell you, you have a 70% likelihood this car is not going to run, right? Or better off, you walk into an airport and you go to the counter to get your ticket, and the person serving you says, welcome to our airline. By the way, you have a 70% chance that you're not going to make it to the other end. How many of us would jump on a plane? Right? None of us. But we do that every day when we spend money into our criminal legal system. We do it every day. And by the way, as soon as we run scared, all we want is to put more money into that system, right? You know, what's the old definition of insanity? Do the same thing over and over again, expect a different result, right? And even in our own experience, we know that if we work on reentry and rehabilitation, we can be successful, right? The Anti-Recidivism Coalition has a tremendous success rate. The Amity Foundation, located right here in LA, has a tremendous success rate. In fact, their recidivism rate is comparable to Scandinavian and European countries, which is what I would call industrialized democracy standard of justice. So, no, I am not an abolitionist. But I do support the concept that we have to begin to right-size the system, and that we have to ensure that what we put public funding is going to give us the highest return on our investment. Just like if you were a business person, you would try to look for the highest return on your investment. When it comes to the criminal legal system, we actually get a very low return on our investment.
Next question.
My question is, so I think invoking Michelle Alexander is beautiful. You know, my quote from Michelle Alexander is, "There's a revolution waiting to be won." You know, and so you know so Mike and like you know, District Attorney Gascon, she saw herself as part of the problem. You know, and that problem was not listening to the voices of the people that were most impacted by the infringement upon the injustice that was being inflicted. You know, so this whole idea of there's a revolution waiting to be won, clearly we see what that is. I mean, you can see the transformation that they had in their personal lives. We can hear your approach to how the system can be changed. What are the obstacles? And I would like to hear comments from each of you. What are the obstacles of this revolution waiting to be won that we're faced with? I mean, you know, I heard structural racism. You know, we hear the term white supremacy thrown up. So what are the real political obstacles that we're faced with as we try to, you know, ensure that this revolution waiting to be won occurs?
Well, and I think we're all going to have, obviously, different experience, and I'm really looking forward to listening from the other speakers. For me, the biggest obstacle is breaking down the culture of mass incarceration. It's baked into our system, and it's baked into our personal beliefs as Americans, right? Most of us, I believe, have grown up into a belief that the harsher the punishment is, the more likely we are of creating safety. So you begin with that premise. Think about it. We want to be as harsh as we can. And then you start adding other components like racism, right? And you start adding other components like loss of opportunities and bad public health and bad educational system, right? And social neglect. So you have a belief that in order for us to achieve safety, we have to be as punitive as possible, which means that we're going to send you to prison for as long as we can, and we develop laws to make sure that that occurs. You have the system that is fueled by racism, because the consequences for behavior, especially in the lower levels of criminality, if you will, are tremendously different, right? Black kids are going to see different consequences for schoolyard behavior, low level of drug use, and other things that kids will do than white kids will, right? But you have a policing and a prosecution system and a complete system that believes that, you know, we actually can ensure safety by being punitive. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes in and says, you know what? There are other places that do it differently and they get a better result. And actually, we have studies and data that shows that incarceration doesn't deter, other than locking people up for a period of time. And by the way, do you know that if you don't provide trauma-informed care to victims, they're going to go back and they're going to harm other people, right? Oh, and by the way, do you know that over-policing a community would actually create a lack of legitimacy and more problems? And you start saying all that, and people say, whoa, wait a minute, you're questioning my core beliefs. You're questioning everything that I believe in. By the way, you're telling me that my entire career has been based on a false premise. And, by the way, you're implying that I'm a racist, right? And what happens? We fight. We fight, right? And I tell people, I try to equate this with any industry that is evolving away from itself, right? If you are in the fossil fuel industry and somebody starts talking to you about building electric cars or putting solar panels, you immediately are going to have an adverse reaction to that. And you're going to do everything that you can to protect fossil fuels. Well, the criminal legal system is no different. We have monetary interests. You know, we build prisons, we build private prisons, we have to supply prisons. We have entire towns in the state of California that depend on the prison that they have, right? We have larger police departments. You know, when I came into the LAPD, we had 6,900 officers in 1978, right? And the city's population was about roughly 3 million people. City's population today is 4 million people. We have 10,000 cops. Do the proportionality. A lot of things that when I was a young cop were either a misdemeanor or no offense are felonies today, right? So all the systems build a constituency. They build financial interest. And what is happening is we're now fighting those interests. As we're going to, not abolishing, but right-sizing. Because, you know, maybe for the mistake that Keira did, maybe she should have been sentenced to prison for 12 years, 15 years, I don't know, but not her entire life, right? I mean, in fact, you were in prison, what, 15 years?
14.
14 years, and look at her. You would want her to be your neighbor, right? You would want her to be a mentor to your kids, right? Because this is someone that's been through it, learned from it, and is actually trying to do the right thing, right? So, but when we send people to prisons for life or for 50 years or 100 years, which is, you know, is almost impossible, right? Very few of us are going to last 100 years in prison. But, you know, each year we're paying $100,000 plus until you're about 50, and then we start paying more because now you start getting sick. And by the time you're 60 and 70, we're really spending a ton of money on you. That money's being sucked away from everything else. And by the way, a large segment of our prison population today are seniors. Are seniors, and they're being held back just simply because of our thirst for punishment. You got people who've been in prison for 40 years, and you talk about releasing them on parole. They're in their 80s, their 70s, and whoa, you know, we fight like hell to keep them in prison until, for what purpose? I don't know. So those are the obstacles. It's that cultural, you know, which comes from a combination of things, but then race plays such a big part.
I want to say, as long as punishment is tied to my race, as long as that's the way it goes in this country, as long as we don't see diversity as a strength, you know, and not a weakness, those are some of the things to me. We live in a moment now in this country where truth is passé, where we don't tell the truth. We say whatever we want to say, and folk believe it or and go with it. Until we are, as a nation, the majority population accept the fact that there should be some repentance for the past. If we don't ever get to that place, then that's a hindrance and a block for us to ever to be fully the kind of multi-racial, multicultural, multi-ethnic society that we should be. These are the kind of, to me, these are the kind of stumbling blocks, that keep us from being fully who we should be as a nation.
I would say I would agree with Mr. Gascon that culture plays a big part. And I noticed that training is a barrier. And the police culture, I think implementation of different training practices is very, very important to move in this system that we are looking forward to pushing it forward. I would also say, as long as we're a society, and I'm just going to echo, that seeks to punish versus hold accountable, we will always have that barrier. I am too for reforming the prison system. As a person who spent 14 years in prison, I needed to be held accountable for what I had done. And I don't think that there was any other way but to be isolated from society for me to get that accountability. But it needs to be, we as a community, we as a nation, we as a state, we need to seek to hold accountable rather than punish. And if we can change that and shift that culture in society to where we're saying, no, I'm going to hold this person accountable, not punish them to make someone else feel better, I think we could move forward with a criminal justice system that is fair for both the victims and for the offender.
Great responses, great responses. A couple of more questions, one more question from the audience, and then I have just a couple of questions I want to pose to D.A. Gascon out of time restraints. Yes?
It's not so much a question, but I will echo what you said. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and similar to you, there's so many wasted lives as a result of community trauma and individuals making decisions. I lost two brothers in 2017 and 2018 to violence in South Central Los Angeles, and I stand before you telling you that there were so many people that just did not have the opportunity. They were brilliant. And until we invest in the front end, the community trauma that results in people like you and people like so many members of my family that were mass incarcerated, nothing's going to change. And one thing that you said I think is very important. I've known George Gascon, 25, 30 years. The only person I've known longer is this brother right here because we were undergrads at UCLA. And we have stories about being stopped by the LAPD back then. But the reality is until the community trauma is addressed and a holistic approach is taken from the front end. You said something I think is very important. Most cops never get to see the inside of incarceration. They see the paperwork, they do all the front end, but they never ever get to experience or see what that does. And I think an important part of police, and I don't like to call it training, it's the paradigm has to shift to education because training is something that becomes rote. It has to be ingrained, and they have to understand before they go into communities like South Central Los Angeles, they have to understand what the dynamics, why that community
faces the challenges that it faces. Why are people so angry at the police? These are the things that before you ever put on a uniform and can begin to hold that community accountable, you have to understand the struggles. But just what you just said, so many individuals in communities like that never get the opportunity because they become victims of their surroundings. And I was blessed, but people talk about it's the family dynamics. My brothers had the same opportunities. I was just blessed, and I'm no different, no better than any of those individuals that just didn't have the opportunities. But I think a true transformation, and that's why I applaud George Gascon, because he's taking the right path. And I think the path for him, I just feel for him because he didn't get any support, because there's no other places other than what he's trying to do that actually is providing those wraparound services, that's looking at the community trauma, looking at the issues of mental health, looking at the dysfunctional schools, looking at all those disadvantages. But by the time he gets them, he's got to try to be that one individual that's providing some progress. So I've said a lot, but a lot needs to be done. But I think the culture of police organizations, but also the entire public support system that necessitates all the things that need to happen in our community needs to be held accountable as well.
Sir, will you introduce yourself? I understand you're someone important. Right?
No, I'm not important. I'm not no one important.
He's being very humble. The chief of police, and
yeah,
he was in the LAPD. We worked together for.
Yeah, we worked together. He was somebody I looked up to. I was always looking up to him. I was several layers below him, but I'm actually the interim chief of police here at UCLA Police Department. And prior to this, I was the chief of police, the chief of public safety at the University of Southern California. I'm also on the consent decree monitoring team for Aurora, Colorado Police Department in light of the Elijah McClain murder.
Thank you. I recognize he was a person of distinction when I walked on campus. He was standing over in the corner with his glasses on. I mean, it's like, that's security. That's the big man right there. Anyways, I never introduced myself, but I'm the Reverend Larry W. Foy. I'm the regional director for the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. We are a faith-rooted, faith-based organization, multi-faith-based organization, Christian, Jews, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and we work statewide, a statewide organization. We collaborate with the SCLC, which is one of the greatest organizations on the planet, and around criminal justice reform issues and immigration issues. But I want to piggyback on the statement you were making about police officers. And one of the people who are on, I think was viewing this live on Facebook, asked the question, this question is, how do we end qualified immunity for police here in Los Angeles, even if unable to change across the country? This is from Ms. Kemp.
And for those of you, just so that we understand, and I'm going to try to give you a layperson's definition, but qualified immunity basically is protected by federal law, by the way, by court decisions, and it basically says that if you're going to hold an officer or actually a public official liable civilly, not criminally, but civilly for conduct, there has to be a clear understanding that prior people similarly situated were found liable for that conduct, and therefore you should know that that conduct would be a path for liability. And if you cannot show that, then you have qualified immunity, meaning that your behavior, because technically you had no prior notice that that behavior was unlawful, you should be given protection and qualified immunity. But again, it doesn't really apply to criminal law. It really applies to civil litigation. And I think often there are misunderstandings is, what qualified immunity is, and a lot of folks think that that may lead to a criminal prosecution or, or that it could be altered at the state level. Some states, like the state of Colorado, actually legislated a workaround the qualified immunity by actually giving people certain rights under the law in Colorado that actually said that they have certain rights to be free from, from certain conduct by police, for instance, right? So instead of taking the right away from the, from public officials, in this case police, and taking away qualified immunity, what it does is it increased the rights of the average citizen. And there are conversations actually in California that have been going on for a good decade, to be frank with you, and more recently, maybe about 3 years ago, about how do we create perhaps legislation in California that increases the right of citizens to be free from, from certain excessive or abusive behavior by police. But again, this is in the realm of civil litigation.
Another question. We see and hear about criminal activity daily via the media, and most media reported criminal activity is violent. As a gentleman said earlier, that your opening statement was, yeah. So the consensus is that crime is rampant, especially violent crimes. Is this true? If so, what factual data can you share with us to either confirm, challenge, or refute the media's narrative and the public perception that crime is running rampant?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and I know that, often people don't want to hear data because data is confusing to all of us, and most of us operate on an emotional level. In fact, I would say all of us operate on an emotional level first, right? And then we try to look for ways to justify our feelings, and we figure how to take data and kind of move it around. And, we are in the largest county in the country. If we were a state, we would be the 8th largest state. So, but yet we have one single media market, right? So, if you were living in some of the smaller states, you may have a TV station that covers a population of 400,000 or 500,000, and then you have another TV station in another part of the state that covers another 400 or 500, and maybe less. Here we have several, media outlets covering 10 million plus. So, because of our size, we're going to see more activity, and sometimes at other communities, we have seen that homicides are significantly down, and they're coming down. And so we're seeing violence actually being reduced as we normalize ourselves and we're getting back to pre-pandemic times. Thirdly, I'd like to point out, and this is a data that has been out for the last year and a half or two, but it often gets ignored, especially when you're looking at the more conservative right-wing media, and I have to say that because that's really where it comes from, that they'll talk about crime going up in urban centers like LA or New York or other parts of the country, but what they don't tell you is that actually per capita crime in these major urban centers is substantially lower than most of those centers that are actually that are being handled by very conservative district attorneys and political structures. So, for instance, you often hear when there is a criminal problem in LA, I get blamed for it. In fact, sometimes I get blamed for stuff that happened before I was in office. Okay, I have been, in Fox News, I have seen sometimes being blamed for a homicide that occurred before I was in office. But what they don't tell you, and you never hear anybody blaming the district attorney, for instance, in Kerr County, who is a very strong lock 'em up, law and order, traditional prosecutor, where per capita their crime rates are much higher, or San Bernardino, Riverside, other neighboring counties that have substantially higher crime rates, right, than we do. And they're doing business as they always have. And what I often tell people is, if you think about it, if locking people up the way that they did, because we still lock up people, by the way, our felony filing rates and convictions rates are very similar to what they have been for the last 10, 12 years. We're just simply trying to seek sometimes a lower sentence. But if in fact that work was so effective, why is it that crime in these communities is higher per capita than it is in our community? Which really speaks to multiple things, by the way, that I often say, and people don't like to hear that either. The reality is that prosecutors have very limited impact on crime rates, okay? And any prosecutor that tells you that he or she can impact crime rates and they're going to end homelessness and they're going to do this and that and all that stuff, I would suggest to you, you run the hell away from that person, right? Because they're lying to you. Because the reality is that what we do doesn't impact crime on the macro level. We may impact an individual at that moment through whatever actions we take, but there are many other factors that impact crime, number one. Number two, and this is proven, again, this is solid research that says that the severity of a sentence doesn't deter people from committing crimes. And I'll give you the extreme example of this. In places where the death penalty is exercised, as it used to be in this county, by the way, before I came here, right? My predecessor put 23 men in death row. 22 of them were men of color, okay? And yet, our homicide rates started to climb in 2020, not when I was a district attorney, but the prior district attorney, even though the death penalty was being exercised. And the reason for it is because there were other things that were happening, right? It was COVID, there was a whole bunch of other things that were happening. So if you think about it, that when people are committing crimes, they're committing murder or they're engaging in very egregious violent conduct, they're not thinking, oh my God, if I get caught, I may actually face the death penalty, right? Because that's not how we think as human beings. First of all, the majority of the crime goes unaccountable for because people do not get arrested, they don't get convicted. Even homicides, which is one of those crimes that there may be the highest rate of arrest, the reality is about 50% of the people that commit murder in this country and in this community will continue to be free, right? If you commit robbery, 82% of those, I'm sorry, not 82, 88% of those are going to continue to commit robberies without any consequences. So if you're robbing people, you're not thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get caught, right? Because you have an 88% likelihood that you're not going to get caught. You don't think about it that way either, by the way. You just simply know intuitively that I'm going to commit a lot of robberies before I get caught and maybe never get caught, right? So the problem with all of this is that, crime actually is generational, generational lower than it has been for many years. It did go up in the last 3 years. Sociologists and criminologists and all that stuff will be arguing for the next 20, 30 years why it went up, and now it's starting to go down. But we have often a disproportionate understanding of what crime is really like because we get bombarded with information in ways that makes us think in a certain way. And then, by the way, we live in the most segregated communication world that we ever have, right? If you turn on the TV or if you are in social media getting your communication, your information, you're only going to the places that are telling you what you want to hear, right? If you believe in certain things and, consistent with that is going to be Fox News, you're never going to go to CNN or ABC. You're going to go to Fox News. On the other hand, if you're on the left, you're going to go to MSNBC or whatever. You're going to see that world, right? And then if you're on social media, we have created algorithms that say, once you click here, this must be what you like, so I'm only going to give you that and not going to give you anything else, right? So you're in Facebook, and you're looking at, the Tucker Carlson and, LA is on fire. You click that 2 or 3 times, and guess what? You're never going to see Lester Holt anymore. Lester Holt doesn't exist. By the way, those of you that do not know, Lester Holt is actually the most viewed TV national anchor, okay, on NBC. But you're never going to see him. You're going to see Tucker Carlson and the like, because that algorithm says that's what you want to hear, and guess what? I'm going to give you what you want to hear, and I'm going to give it to you over and over and over again. And that is why we have such a distorted view of the impact of crime today.
Very, very good. Very good. Very good. I know that we're pressed with time, but I just got to get these two more questions out, and one is kind of follow-up. Patsy, you want to follow up with your question? Hey, I think he kind of answered some of it, but just...
No, I think he has answered it. It's
Okay.
mostly about, not the most violent crimes, but the increase in home invasions that we hear about, particularly on the side of Los Angeles, and what you think is the responsible, is it COVID, is it the change in bail policy? People are blaming you, understand? So I want you to tell us what the real reason is.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, look, there is no question there was an uptick in home invasion robberies. Again, and I'm always careful how I say this because, you know, how you feel is how you feel, right? The numbers don't matter. Those numbers, by the way, have come down, and they're substantially lower than they were, you know, 15, 20 years ago, right? But there was an uptick on that, and mostly it was driven by certain groups that were very active, and that is subsiding because the police was able to get onto it. And there were some people that were talking about the zero bail policy, for instance. And it's important to understand, first of all, that district attorneys do not set bail, right? The way that bail is set in our state, and by the way, in most jurisdictions, but in our state, there are 58 counties. And every year, each superior court for that county sets up the bail schedule for that county. And basically what they do is they look at the penal code, and they say, if you commit this offense, this is going to be your bail. And then they give it to the police departments, and what happens is when you get arrested, a police or a detention officer in LA County Jail or in LAPD jail will look at it and say, okay, you got arrested for robbery, bail for robbery with no priors is, let's say, $50,000. This is a made-up number, okay, $50,000. You can call a bail bonds person here, and for $5,000 bond, you can get out. So you call grandma or whoever, or if you're actually robbing people, you probably got the money, and you pay the $5,000 and you get released, and then you get a court date to come back. You never see a prosecutor. The prosecutor hasn't even seen your case. Now, if you're poor and you don't have grandma and you're not robbing people, you don't have the money, you're probably going to stay in jail for a while. Now, during COVID, something a little differently happened. The Judicial Council, which is kind of the overseeing body of all the courts in the state, says, we got people that are dying in our jails and prisons, and we need to lower the population. Because too many people congregated in the small settings are being harmful to one another, and they're harming everybody else because they're getting released eventually. So they said, we're going to create a zero bail policy, an emergency bail policy system where if you commit a misdemeanor or a nonviolent felony, you don't have to pay bail. You're just simply going to get released, and you're going to be given a date to come back to court. By the way, traditionally, the system says you generally get cited back to come back to court in 30 days, but during the COVID period of time, people were being cited 90 to 120 days later. So the person that committed it, let's say the person stole a car. You hear the thing about the same guy that stole 3 or 4 cars in a week. They came in, stealing a car is not a violent crime, so they go on the no bail policy, they go out, they steal another car, they come back again, they get released again. By the way, the cite back for the first time is about 4 months down the line. We're not seeing these cases because the police is not presenting those cases. And the real point of reference was the smash and grabs that happened at the Grove during Thanksgiving in 2021, right? And if you recall, the chief of police and the mayor, Mayor Garcetti, got up and said, this is horrendous, and the no bail and no cash bail and all this stuff. And the implication was that somehow that was my policy, which, by the way, I'm against cash bail, and I'll get into that in a moment, but it had nothing to do with this. Some of those people that were involved in the smash and grab were cited. This was Thanksgiving weekend, so November of 2021. They were cited back for late March of 2022. And they went out and they continued to, some of them, not all of them, committed other crimes. They got arrested, they got released again, and I was being blamed, and we hadn't even seen a single case of that, right? So we are now no longer in the emergency bail. We're back to normal. But we have another component that we're facing right now. The county jail is again getting crowded, and there are multiple lawsuits, and the sheriff is under a lot of pressure to start releasing people, right? And again, that has nothing to do with the district attorney. And the reality is that the conditions in our jail are inhumane, and people that are presumed to be innocent are being held back because they cannot afford to pay the bail. So I would not be surprised if you see a settlement that comes back to something close to the no cash bail. Furthermore, the California Supreme Court on a case that was decided about 2.5, 3 years ago said that, it's called the Humphrey case, by the way, if you want to look it up, basically said that a person cannot be held in pretrial confinement for a non-serious, non-violent crime just simply because they cannot afford to pay cash bail. Which is, by the way, it's a constitutional guarantee, right? We're not guilty, we're innocent until proven guilty, but when we're holding people back because they cannot afford cash bail, just simply based on their poverty, not based on their level of dangerousness or the likelihood of, fleeing the jurisdiction, they're being treated as if they were guilty before they were proven innocent. So that is the reality. That's why people get out. They don't come to the district attorney's office. They get cited back, and that's the cycle. And certainly that was the no bail emergency bail system that was put during COVID. Now, let me tell you why I'm against bail, and I'm very open about it. And I will continue to say this over and over again. How much money you have in your bank account should not be the determining factor as to whether you're going to get released or not. And I'm going to give you a perfect example. During that period of time that we're talking about, during the COVID cycle, people that committed violent crimes were required to post bail. And we had a gentleman in early 2021 that he got arrested for armed robbery and a home invasion robbery. And he posted bail. And then he got caught again. He posted bail. He posted bail 3 times for a total of nearly $500,000 of the bonds that he paid. Because he had the money, because he was robbing people. Okay? And then on the last cycle, and by the way, he had not been brought in front of the district attorney's office yet. Because the courts were jammed and we were not, everything was moving a lot slower. He actually committed a homicide. Between the third release and the final time that he was arrested. And this person posted bail each and every time. Even though he was so dangerous that probably after the second time we should have held him back regardless of how much money he had, because he was dangerous. When I was the district attorney in San Francisco, and I'm only giving you some extreme example, but these examples happen every day. We had a tech billionaire actually, that beat his girlfriend very badly. He was arrested. We filed charges on him. The judge set a bail at $1 million. He posted bail immediately, not a bond. He posted $1 million in cash. Was released. Within 90 days, he went on to abuse another women. That man, based on his behavior, should have been held in prison regardless of how much money he had. But he wasn't, because he had the capacity to bail out. There is nothing that says that because you have money to bail out, that makes you less dangerous. In fact, it often isn't the case. Just like there is nothing that says that if you're poor, you're going to be more dangerous. We need to start creating a system where if we're going to hold you back in pretrial confinement, it's based on your dangerousness, and there should be a process where the prosecutor alleges that, and the defense has an opportunity to fight that, and then the court decides. But that's not what we have today.
Thank you. One final question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Smart for the final words, and let him give thanks for everyone's participation. Here's the final question. How is your office working with faith leaders who are first responders, but often overlooked as such, do you have a person, I think you mentioned Ms. Blacknell's role, do you have a person or an office that function as liaison to faith leaders? If not, will you consider establishing an entity that connects directly to faith leaders and the faith community?
So, yes, Ms. Blacknell is a liaison. And we're actually in the process, as I mentioned earlier today, I talked about it, community advisory boards, and we're now in the process of creating our clergy community advisory board, which will be rolling out very soon, and that will be one of the conduits. But I can tell you that much like we're doing today, we are often in front of faith leaders, having conversations around what we're doing in the office, how can we improve, and that has been ongoing from the very time that I got elected and before, but we're now in the process of actually formalizing that as we created a series of advisory boards. The one that is being now assembled is the one for interfaith, and you're one of them. Okay, so we have a member here. So and we're hoping to begin having those those conversations around policy and sort of moving forward. What are the things that we need to do?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's give Reverend Foy a hand for, and all of the, Brother Doe, Brother Anton, Sister Patsy, Brother, my brother over here, as he said. JT. I'm talking about Vusi, there you go. And all of our committee, thank you so much. And I want to thank you, my sister, God, my brother. I heard your story from someone else, but my brother is powerful. God bless you so, so much, Pastor Gary. And of course, our DA, Dr. Brother Doe. I'm sorry, I didn't acknowledge you, did I? Our committee person, Brother Doe, thank you for the refreshments and everything. We really came together, and this is just the beginning. I don't want to be any longer. And so, Attorney Gascon, DA Gascon, thank you so very much. Off the record now, I'm not in my role as SCLC, but he is running for re-election. That's had nothing to do with this tonight, and that's the committee I want to be on. Okay, the re-elect. I want to be on his re-election. Amen. Next year. Okay. Thank you all, and I just want to announce this is Martin Luther King, what we call the Sacrifice Month. It's called that because he gave his life for the people and the community. And we have several other events that are going on. There's a Seder tomorrow night in Long Beach. But on the 15th, we're having our big luncheon, and Senator Raphael Warnock will be here on the 15th at 11:30 at the Gateway Hotel. You can go online and get your ticket. We hope that all of you will. Our deadline for that is this coming Friday, and the tickets are going fast. God bless you so much for being here, and thank the organizers and for pulling this together. That's it. Patsy, did I take care of everything? Okay.
I've got to leave quickly, so I have a request. Can we take a group picture with all of the event coordinators and our guests, and then can we take a group picture with everyone who's assembled right now? Okay, so can we do that?
Okay. Just sit right here. Come on.
We actually,
Patsy, come on.
in San Francisco,